There are over 8 billion humans on this planet right now, building, paving, burning, and reshaping nearly every surface we touch. But if every single one of us vanished tonight, nature wouldn't just survive, it would erase us with terrifying efficiency. So today, we're running a thought experiment grounded in real environmental science, real engineering data, and one of the most studied accidental case studies on Earth, to find out exactly how long it would take for the planet to forget we ever existed. The framework for this isn't science fiction. It comes from a real field called industrial ecology, the study of how human infrastructure decays without maintenance, and from a real, unintentional experiment that's been running for almost 4 decades. In 1986, the Chernobyl disaster forced the evacuation of the city of Pripyat, and humans never came back. Today, Pripyat is a forest. Trees grow through the floors of apartment buildings. Wolves, lynx, and wild boar roam streets that used to have traffic lights. That single abandoned city is our blueprint for what happens to the entire planet, just scaled up by a factor of a few 100 million homes, and stretched across thousands of years. Even the air itself starts changing almost immediately, because without billions of cars, factories, and power plants running nonstop, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels would begin a slow, measurable decline within the very first year, something scientists actually got a small real-world preview of during the global shutdowns of 2020. So let's start the clock and watch civilization unravel hour by hour. Within the first few hours of our disappearance, the lights start going out, literally. Most power grids run on a delicate, constantly managed balance between supply and demand. And without engineers monitoring control rooms around the clock, that balance collapses fast. Coal and gas plants need a continuous human hand to keep fuel moving. And within hours, most plants begin shutting down automatically as safety systems trip to prevent explosions. Nuclear plants are built with passive shutdown protocols specifically designed for a scenario like this one, so reactors scram and cool down, mostly safely. Though a handful of plants in less stable regions could still face the kind of meltdown risk the world saw at Fukushima. By day 2, most of the planet is dark. Without electricity, water treatment plants stop pumping, and pressurized water systems across every city begin losing pressure within hours. Within about 36 hours, the New York City subway system, which currently requires constant pumping to stay dry, begins flooding. Because the city itself sits on a high water table, and the only thing keeping those tunnels dry was human labor working in shifts around the clock for over a century. Within a week, food spoils everywhere, refrigeration fails completely, and billions of pets and farm animals that depended entirely on us are suddenly on their own. Dogs mostly don't survive long without help, since most breeds were never built for self-sufficiency. But cats, chickens, pigs, and cattle that manage to escape their pens start to feral out into the landscape almost immediately. This is where the first dark turn kicks in early, much earlier than most people expect. All those nuclear power plants we just mentioned, the ones with passive shutdown systems, still need active, human-operated cooling for their spent fuel pools for years afterward. Without that maintenance, a percentage of the world's roughly 440 active commercial reactors could experience spent fuel pool fires or partial meltdowns within the first 1 to 2 years, releasing localized radioactive contamination in scattered pockets across the globe. So the first irony of our disappearance is that humanity's most advanced energy technology becomes, almost immediately, one of its most dangerous legacies. Now let's fast forward to the 1-year mark, because this is where cities that look completely indestructible start visibly cracking. Asphalt roads, which rely on regular sealing to keep water from seeping into the base layer, start growing weeds through every seam within just a few months. And by year 1, full-size plants are pushing straight through highway surfaces. Storm drains clog with leaves, branches, and debris because nobody's clearing them anymore, which means streets start flooding seasonally. And that standing water accelerates erosion underneath the pavement itself. Even traffic lights and street signs, stripped of paint and rusted through within a decade, eventually topple over in the first strong storm. Nobody's there to clean up after. Suburban houses fare worse than most people expect, honestly. Wood frame homes depend entirely on functioning gutters and intact roofing to stay dry. And the moment water finds a way in, mold and structural rot take over within a single rainy season. According to research compiled in journalist Alan Wiseman's well-known examination of this exact scenario, an average American house left completely unmaintained could see its roof fail within roughly 20 years, letting the elements pour in completely. So what does the 5-year mark actually look like on the ground? This is where things get visually wild, fast. Pripyat's real-world timeline tells us that by year 5, parks and gardens are already unrecognizable, swallowed whole by aggressive, self-seeding pioneer species like birch and poplar, the kinds of trees that specifically thrive in disturbed, abandoned soil. Golf courses, manicured lawns, and city parks all become dense, tangled thickets within this same window. Concrete sidewalks, which seem permanent to us, actually have a hidden freeze-thaw weakness baked right in, since water seeps into microscopic cracks, freezes, expands, and over repeated seasonal cycles, shatters entire slabs from the inside out. Bridges become a serious concern around this point too, because steel rebar buried inside concrete corrodes the instant it's exposed to consistent moisture, expanding and cracking the surrounding concrete shell from within, a slow-motion process engineers grimly call spalling. Without inspection or repair crews, that process, which normally takes a full century to play out, gets a brutal head start. Inside abandoned buildings, the contents of our entire civilization start dissolving even faster than the structures around them, since paper, the material holding most of human history's written knowledge, breaks down rapidly once humidity and mold take hold, meaning most of the world's books and printed records could be unreadable pulp within just a few decades. 20 years in, and we're firmly in genuine Pripyat territory for a real-world comparison. Building interiors are essentially gone by this point. Ceilings have collapsed from sustained water damage, and entire neighborhoods have become dense forest. This is also roughly the point where most of the world's dams begin to fail in earnest. Hoover Dam was engineered to extraordinary tolerances and could theoretically last for centuries without a single human hand, but the tens of thousands of smaller, far more numerous hydroelectric and flood-control dams scattered across the world are not built to anywhere near that same standard. As their spillway gates rust shut or clog completely with decades of debris, they begin overtopping and breaching, unleashing catastrophic, decades overdue floods downstream onto landscapes nobody is left to warn. Rivers that had been tamed by concrete channels for a century start carving new paths almost immediately, reclaiming floodplains we drained generations ago, and fish populations in places like the Hudson and the Thames, freed from chemical runoff and ship traffic, begin rebounding within just a handful of years. Now, here's where the scale of this thought experiment starts escalating hard. At the 50-year mark, most wood and steel frame buildings have already collapsed entirely. Skyscrapers are the great exception to this rule, because their core structural steel can resist corrosion for considerably longer. But the glass curtain walls that make modern cities look like glittering forests of mirrors start failing one by one as their seals degrade in the weather. Without any climate control running inside, freeze-thaw cycles inside those empty buildings accelerate their structural decay rapidly from within. Suspension bridges, like San Francisco's Golden Gate, require continuous, never-ending painting to prevent rust, a maintenance job so massive that crews historically start over again the literal moment they finish the last coat. Without that paint, engineers estimate the steel cables could begin failing somewhere between 50 and 100 years out, and entire bridges would eventually slip quietly into the water below. Even something as massive as the Eiffel Tower, which already requires repainting roughly every 7 years just to survive ordinary weather, would likely rust through its joints and collapse within a couple of centuries without that constant human attention. By the time we reach the 200 to 300-year mark, most of humanity's iconic skylines are simply gone. Steel skyscrapers, even the most well-engineered ones on the planet, eventually succumb to relentless rust and lose their structural integrity, buckling and collapsing largely within this exact window. Cities that we spent centuries carefully constructing are reduced to overgrown, unrecognizable rubble fields choked with vegetation. But here's a strange and genuinely surprising twist in this whole story. The deepest parts of our infrastructure last far longer than any of the shiny parts on the surface ever could. Underground subway tunnels, sealed away from direct sunlight and dramatic surface weather, could remain partially intact for thousands of years, essentially fossilizing underground the exact same way ancient Roman sewers and aqueducts have quietly survived for nearly 2,000 years right under our feet today. Speaking of which, here's a fact that puts our entire modern world in perspective. The Pantheon in Rome has stood for almost 2,000 years specifically, because Roman engineers used a unique volcanic ash concrete that actually gets stronger over time with seawater exposure, a formula modern materials science only fully decoded within roughly the past decade. Most of our modern concrete, by stark comparison, will be reduced to dust long before anything we're building right now comes anywhere close to that kind of ancient legacy. The Great Pyramid of Giza offers an even older benchmark, since it has already stood for over 4,500 years through nothing but simple, gravity-stacked limestone and granite. And geologists estimate its core structure could realistically remain standing for tens of thousands of years more, long after every modern skyscraper has returned to rubble. So what actually survives the 1,000-year mark and beyond? Bronze statues do remarkably well across deep time, because bronze naturally develops a protective patina that can shield it for millennia. which is part of the exact reason ancient bronze artifacts still sit safely behind glass in museums today. Glass also survives an oddly, almost unsettlingly long time if it happens to be buried and protected from direct UV light and physical stress, since glass at a molecular level is chemically very stable, meaning a single glass bottle tossed into a landfill could theoretically still be perfectly recognizable hundreds of thousands of years from right now. Now, let's hit the real dark turn of this entire story, the one that changes everything we think we know about our legacy. Buried deep in repositories, cooling pools, and temporary storage sites around the world right now is a massive stockpile of high-level nuclear waste, and the most dangerous isotopes inside that waste, like plutonium-239, have a half-life of roughly 24,000 years. That means it takes somewhere in the staggering range of 100,000 to 250,000 years for that material to finally decay down to background safety levels. This is the exact reason the United States government commissioned warning markers for the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Repository specifically meant to remain legible and viscerally terrifying to whatever future species or culture eventually finds them 10,000 generations from now, long after English, or possibly even the entire concept of written language as we currently understand it, no longer exists in any recognizable form. In other words, our single most dangerous legacy will quietly outlive our cities, our spoken languages, our carved statues, and very possibly our own species' memory of itself, by staggering orders of magnitude. Even something as seemingly indestructible as the International Space Station won't escape this timeline, since without regular reboost maneuvers from ground control, its orbit would decay within just a few years, sending it burning back through the atmosphere far sooner than almost anything left on the surface below. Let's keep climbing the scale together, because the timeline only gets stranger from here. At around the 10,000-year mark, which is roughly the same span of time since the construction of the earliest known human civilizations, places like Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, nearly every visible trace of our current global civilization has already been fully reabsorbed into forest, swamp, desert, or open grassland. Geologists studying our current era have actually already given it a formal scientific name, the Anthropocene, a proposed geological epoch defined entirely by humanity's measurable, permanent impact on Earth's actual rock and soil layers. And that's the true climax of this whole thought experiment, because even after every single road, every skyscraper, and every monument we've ever built is completely gone, we will have already permanently written ourselves into Earth's deep geological record forever. A thin, dark layer of plastic microparticles, fine concrete dust, and radioactive isotopes left over from 20th century nuclear weapons testing will exist embedded in sedimentary rock essentially forever. A permanent fingerprint that future geologists, whether human, alien, or something else entirely, could one day read like a single chapter carved directly into stone. Mount Rushmore, carved directly into solid granite back in the 1930s, is estimated by geologists to erode away at a glacially slow rate of roughly 1 inch every 10,000 years, meaning the carved faces of 4 American presidents could theoretically remain at least partially visible for over 7 million years into the future, making it quite possibly one of the longest-lasting deliberate human creations to ever exist on the surface of this planet. Meanwhile, far above our crumbling, forested cities, the satellites and scattered space debris currently orbiting in high geostationary orbit, completely untouched by atmospheric drag, could remain locked in orbit for millions upon millions of years. Silent metal ghosts endlessly circling a planet that no longer remembers building any of them in the first place. And further out still, almost unimaginably far from home, the 2 Voyager probes, currently drifting through true interstellar space and carrying the golden record, a literal physical audio time capsule packed with human voices, music, and recorded greetings, will very likely outlast the Earth itself entirely, continuing to silently drift through the galaxy for potentially billions of years after our own sun eventually swells into a red giant and renders our home planet completely unrecognizable. So here's the question this entire thought experiment ultimately leaves us with. If skyscrapers eventually crumble, nuclear waste eventually fades into background noise, and even something as solid as Mount Rushmore slowly erodes into dust over deep geological time, then what's actually left of us in the end? Maybe it isn't the buildings at all, and maybe it was never really about the roads or the bridges or the monuments in the first place. Maybe the truest, most honest fingerprint we leave behind is something far quieter than any of that, a thin chemical signature buried silently in rock, a handful of radio waves drifting outward into the void at the speed of light, expanding forever in every direction, carrying the accidental echo of every single broadcast we ever made, whether we ever intended to send them out into the universe or not. Somewhere out there right now, those very signals are still traveling outward, a faint ghost transmission of human civilization heading silently towards stars we will personally never live to see. It's a genuinely strange thing to sit with, that the most permanent thing about all of us might not be anything we ever built on purpose at all. Every wall we ever painted, every road we ever paved, every flag we ever planted on a mountaintop, all of it turns out to be temporary, on a timescale nature barely notices. It might simply be the noise we made without even realizing, at the time, that anyone out there could be listening. And if that quiet idea turns out to be true, then maybe the real question we should be asking isn't how long it would take nature to erase every trace of us from this planet. Maybe the real question is whether anything out there in that vast darkness is actually paying attention before it finally does. But what happens if Earth doesn't just quietly lose its people, but loses its entire atmosphere overnight instead? Well, that's a story for another What If.